And the war in Ukraine is pushing global food prices sharply higher. Russia and Ukraine produce nearly a third of the world's wheat, and the conflict is disrupting supplies. Russia says it's willing to allow grain exports from Ukraine, but only if the West eases sanctions against it. The United Nations is looking for a solution to avert a looming food crisis.
A friendly visit to Vladimir Putin. A rare sight as the West announces fresh sanctions. But Senegal's President Macky Sall says it isn't right for Africa to be caught in the crosshairs, cut off from crucial grain imports from Ukraine and Russia. Sall, current chairperson of the African Union, says Putin is willing to help. We're leaving here very reassured and very happy with our exchange. It's not over yet. We must continue discussions with the other parties so that trade resumes immediately. There is a catch. Russia says it will let grain shipments leave Ukraine only if sanctions are lifted. Meanwhile, Ukraine alleges Russia is stealing grain to supply its allies. The UN says it's leading tense talks with Russia to release the exports. With a third of global wheat supplies coming from Ukraine and Russia, the stakes are enormous.
There are 1.4 billion people that can be affected because of the shortage of wheat and other grains. And unblocking trade routes in the Black Sea must remain the priority. Failure to open those ports will result in famine, destabilization, and mass migration around the world.
With wheat prices already soaring across Africa, a looming global food crisis is fast becoming a reality for many.
And I'm joined now by Joe Glauber, Senior Research Fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute. He joins us from Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. Wheat prices have risen by 56% since this time last year. Around the world, that's translating into people seeing the cost of the food that they buy go up. But who is suffering the most from massive increases like that?
Well, as you say, these are globally traded commodities. The prices are being felt everywhere in the world, but clearly the poorest are feeling the brunt. And in particular, those countries that depend heavily on wheat for consumption. So if you look at countries of the North Africa, Middle East, Central Asia, those are countries that consume about twice that of what we consume in the U.S. or in Europe. On a per capita basis. So it's a big part of the diets. In Egypt, it's 35% of the calories come from wheat products like bread. And there you've seen, unsubsidized wheat prices or bread prices rise astronomically. Thankfully, there are targeted subsidies in Egypt to try to address problems for the poorest households. But for countries that have very little resources to provide towards consumers and to help mitigate some of these price impacts, they're the ones that are suffering the most.
Now, the Kremlin denies that it is to blame for the blockade of Ukrainian ports, and the UN and the African Union are pushing for them to be reopened. How optimistic should we be that we will see that happen?
I think it's very difficult. I would certainly hope that those ports would be reopened. It is difficult to get those sorts of assurances that I think the world's going to need. I mean, remember that these aren't necessarily countries owning the ships. These are private companies. They require assurances that their ships won't be targeted. So insurance rates are extremely high right now. And right now, it's just physically, they're unable to move into those ports because of the mines and because of the threats even before. I mean, remember that Russia actually was blockading those ports a week before the soldiers actually came across borders. So this has been a very big problem, and it's expensive to move grain any other way. So going out through the West on rail or barge is just 4 times the cost of going down through the Black Sea.
Okay, I'd like to come back to you in just a moment, but first, let's hear from the World Food Program. They've been warning of global famine if access to Black Sea ports is not reopened.
So the Black Sea ports are, as it were, the silver bullet when it comes to avoiding global famines, global hunger. But if that silver bullet isn't found, we also need those alliances to support overland deliveries of food exporting from this country, a country that fed 400 million people last year.
So they're calling those ports a silver bullet. You touched on this just briefly, but do you think that overland routes can be a realistic alternative?
Frankly, in the short run, I think it's going to be very difficult. I mean, it is, you can do it, and they are doing it. But it's essentially means shipping by rail, going upstream, if you will, because all the grain typically now comes down through those ports. But you can go back up through out through to the river ports on the Danube, down to get ports in Romania, or up through Poland in the Baltics to try to get access to the Baltic Sea. But remember that it adds a lot of cost to do so. The rail gauges aren't the same, so that is the rail tracks are wider in Ukraine than they are in Romania. They have to be offloaded, reloaded, put onto barges, then taken down canals to get to the Black Sea, and all this adds an enormous amount of cost. Plus, it just can't handle the volumes that we typically see going out of the Black Sea in those ports around Odessa.
Sounds like a huge logistical challenge. Longer term, it's not going to be just about supplies, is it? But also about future harvests. Ukraine's spring wheat crop should be going into the ground already for harvest this fall, for example. How do you see that playing out in the long term?
Yeah, we have a bigger problem in the near term. We have the fall planted wheat that is coming, that right now people predict around 20 million tons. Remember that we have about 20 million tons already stuck in Ukraine from last year that hasn't been marketed, which typically would be marketed before the new crop comes in. And so I think that the challenge is going to be how to store that without losing it, because it right now it just can't move in the volumes that typically would be needed. And so that means putting it into storage facilities, some of which have been damaged by the war. But the bigger problem is that they're already, I won't say completely full, but they are already far fuller than they should be at this time of year. So that means storing grain on the ground or finding temporary storage, all of which adds cost.
Okay. Joe Glauber from the International Food Policy Research Institute, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Thanks, Claire.